This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On September 24th, the RCMI held its first speakers event for the 2015 fall season. Our guest speaker at Police Appreciation Night was retired Ontario Provincial Police Commissioner Chris Lewis, who addressed the gathering on First Nations policing, the future.
Doing some interesting things right now, but you didn't come to hear much about me. So very briefly, after retiring from the military, 25 years as a nursing officer, most of the time as a mental health nurse, I've taken on the role as adjunct professor at Nipissing University, primarily looking at the study of operational stress injuries, and I was co-investigator in the study to look at the operational stress injury rates in police in Ontario. And that's the connection that brought me here along with Chris Lewis. So I have the honor and privilege of introducing our guest speaker, retired OPP Commissioner Chris Lewis. Commissioner Lewis, Commander of the Order of the Merit of the Police Forces, has had a long and storied career in law enforcement. His major accomplishments and progression through the ranks were well listed in the flyer for tonight's event, so I won't bore you with rereading those. Instead, I'll relate my personal tribute to why Chris Lewis embodies leadership and his advice on police matters continues to be sought. In the spring of 2010, just prior to Chris being appointed commissioner, retired OPP Inspector Bruce Kruger initiated a complaint to the Ontario Ombudsman stating that he, quote, endured a lack of support and stigma, unquote, from the OPP related to his post-traumatic stress disorder. What followed was a full investigation by the Ombudsman, culminating in his October 2012 report in the line of duty that was extremely critical of the culture of the OPP towards members within OSI. Many a CEO, when faced with such criticism, would go into damage control mode to protect themselves. But that's not the way Commissioner Lewis handled it. As a true leader, Chris listened and acted in the best interest of the OPP and its members. He didn't view it as an attack. He acted on what was an opportunity to strengthen the OPP. In the military, our slogan for mental health care providers was, mental health, a force multiplier. And Commissioner Lewis recognized that truism through his instinctive leadership in which he strove to care for the welfare of his members. The groundwork laid by Chris Lewis provided me with the potential to set up the research team for our study of operational stress injury rates of police in Ontario. Dr. Grohl at Queen's University is well into the analysis of the data that we collected from over 14,000 Ontario police, sworn members and civilian employees from April 2014 to March 2015. Although First Nations police made up only a fraction of the respondents, some of the early results showed signs of First Nations police having higher rates of PTSD. We'll have to wait to see if the differences are significant, but what it says to me is that First Nations police work presents challenges that may potentially be more traumatic, or there may be differences in training or the number of personnel that reduce the chance to build resiliency. This may be closer to the truth. In April of 2013, his presentation to the Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security, Commissioner Lewis stated, compared to the vast majority of provincial and municipal police services in Ontario, most First Nation communities are woefully under-resourced, and as a result, have inadequately trained and equipped officers. If that's the way it was in 2013, what will the future look like for First Nations policing? So tonight, to provide us with his expert insight, the RCMI is proud to introduce Chris Lewis, a true police leader. Chris.
Well, thank you, Stan, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A true pleasure for me to be here tonight, and I want to thank the organizers of the event for inviting me, for serving beef, because I don't get that at home a lot. Unless my wife's away, and she is right now, so I can whip up the odd steak or the odd roast myself. But such a pleasure to be among such an auspicious crowd. Some folks I know well. I see Bobby O, old Air Force, I shouldn't say old, but a former Air Force guy. Back there, you know, Kim Derry from Toronto Police, and my friend Brian sitting there in red looking like $1 million, Lori, and many, many others. I'm really honored to be here. I'm going to start off with a little history lesson about First Nations in North America and in this country, because I think it's important to set some context about First Nations policing. So just think back to your schooling as a young person in this country, as this is where you're raised, but prior to the arrival and the eventual settling of Europeans in this country in the 15th century, this continent was totally inhabited by First Nations people. There were no provinces, no states, no borders, no governments, no police departments, no armies, no municipalities, constitutions, absolutely nothing. No frameworks, no schools, no jails. And the First Nations people of North America roamed with total unfettered access to all resources, to all land, to all waterways, all the fertile fishing grounds, all the fertile agricultural territories, and the nicest of lands at the mouths of rivers and the long shorelines of the Great Lakes, etc. That was them. They live very healthy lifestyles. They got lots of physical exercise in their daily routines, hunting and fishing and eating most of the meat from animals that they killed and fashioning hides into furs and furs into clothing. They used the bones of animals. There wasn't nothing that didn't get used when they killed a moose, for example. They became tools and weapons, as well as hunting and fishing implements. Many of these people lived along the main transportation routes, many of them being rivers across the continent. They hadn't been exposed to the diseases yet that were, and plagues of the Mediterranean countries that were totally unknown to their systems, their physical bodies. But they did have their own system of laws and their own governments and religions. But along came Christopher Columbus and many to follow, and that changed. And over the coming centuries, they were largely exterminated in North America, to some degree by the new governments and their armies, as they were forced off the fertile land and away from the transportation routes in which they once lived. Many died from exposure to those diseases that they weren't prepared for. The land deals and treaties that were struck with them were struck with the King of England, and eventually with the emerging governments of the two new countries of North America. Many of these deals for land were done through government-appointed translators in English. Not well understood, if at all, by any First Nations people. They marched in the late 1700s across North America for this big meeting in Niagara, and there was no cars and airplanes and whatnot for them to get there, so they walked for months and years to get there. Were given some deals in English and signed them, and then marched back and were brought back a year later to sign another one, and as these things were amended. But many of these deals for land were done through these translators, never really well understood, and the spoken word about what was agreed to was passed down through generations of First Nations families for many, many generations to come. Reserves were formed, reserved land for natives to live on, sometimes along the Great Lakes and sometimes not in the nicest places. The rules were established, names were given out by federal Indian agents. If your name happened to be Shakabuskum and the Indian agent couldn't say that or spell it, your name became Smith or Jones, and that was just the reality of the day. Religion, language forced on them, children were taken away to residential schools over the years to come, either came home with horrific tales of abuse, sexual and physical, or never returned at all, because hundreds of those kids died and never returned. So you're living on a land far north in Ontario, and your kids are taken away by the RCMP at that time, because they were the police of the day in those territories, and either didn't come back or they did come back and talked about being abused. And when the government of Canada was approached about this, they said, don't talk to us, talk to the King of England, that's who you signed the agreement with. That didn't help them much. The provinces, eventually, as they formed, had responsibility for native lands, and the people that approached the provinces to complain about things and deals gone bad said blame the feds, it wasn't us. And the feds said blame the King of England. Nobody really wanted to be responsible. So, in that little history lesson, do you see a disaster in the making, or is it just me? And I don't for 1 minute condone some of the violent things that have occurred in protests and the laws being broken and all the things that we have seen happen since Oka, Gustafson Lake in British Columbia, and many, many events in this province. I don't just for a minute suggest that all of these things that occurred over hundreds of years would justify any of those illegal acts. But when you're a young 19-year-old that's been told your whole life that that land over there that they're building condos on right now and somebody's making millions of dollars on, we own it. And whether or not they do is another matter, but that's what the kids are told. We own it. We've got a land claim before the courts. It's moving at glacial speed. In the meantime, somebody's making millions of dollars and they're still giving building permits out for that land that we own. So this creates an awful tension and an awful situation. Factories and everything are being built on disputed land. So we had the Oka event in 1990, Gustafson Lake in BC. Awful violent confrontations, lives lost, at least a police officer killed in Oka. We had Ipperwash in 1995 in Ontario, where we marched troops down the road to take back a little piece of land that since has been granted to the First Nations community. A life was taken and lost. Many people were hurt, including police officers. Lives were forever changed. And I'm not at all being critical of the decision that was made at that time. But we learned a lot from that. And the courts ruled on a lot of issues around that. There was a public inquiry that cost millions of dollars around those issues. And the valuable lesson we learned is, within 5 minutes of taking that land back, we lost it back. And all those lives were forever changed, and for what? There had to be a better way to handle those things. Once again, not being critical of those that did handle it at the time, but that was then. These protests became violent, very protracted, all tense, and lives were forever changed. Over the years to follow, more and more of these events across the country, Ontario became a real lightning rod for these events, and the OPP became in some respects, the Antichrist to some that felt go in and kick their rears and get them off that land. And we're dealing with issues they couldn't solve, they didn't create. These are bigger than a policing issue. Yeah, nobody can be hurt, and we have to take these things through court. But some of them have been before the courts for so long, the judges have died. The negotiators have been replaced 1,000 times. And the frustration of the community is this ever going to move anywhere? Meantime, you're building a Walmart on that land that was promised to us. And whether we like it or not, in many cases it's true. They own the land. I don't know what the solution is, but those are issues to be sorted out by governments and by judicial processes in some case. But they're huge policing challenges, no-win situations for the police. They're resource intensive, they're very complex. The OPP used to get called in to help municipal police departments all the time because we had so many resources, and that was part of our mandate. We're funded in part. For the first time in our history, we were calling in everybody that would send a body to help us. Toronto sent piles of people, London, York Region, everybody had to help us because we couldn't handle it ourselves, and that was just Caledonia. And some said, go in there and get them out of there. Well, you know what? It's not that easy. We did go in and kick them off the land at one point, and within an hour, there's 1,000 people there. There's not enough cops in Ontario to take on a crowd of people with bats and guns and everything else that were there. Was it right for them to do that? No. But tough for us to deal with. So we're left to contain, mediate, negotiate, and try and deal with these things. Keep the peace, document what occurs, video record events, protect rights and public safety, investigate and lay charges largely after the fact. Someone jumps across the line and punches somebody and then runs back into a group of 1,000 protesters. It's not as easy as, well, we'll send a couple guys and grab him and bring him out and put him before the courts. We know who he is, we've got a video, we'll get him. What's the rush? But to the untrained eye, the public, and I get their opinion. Why didn't you take action? Why didn't you go after that guy? It's not that simple. We're gonna get people hurt. We're gonna get people killed. And at one point in Caledonia, we knew that if we went in, that we were gonna be met with aggression that was only a military operation. It was not a policing operation anymore. Can't tell the public all that, but that's the reality of the day. So we had to take a very careful, measured approach, a very gradual application of force. And that was the reality of life. Now, there were times when immediate arrests were necessary, and we did it, but we had hundreds of officers hurt, hundreds of civilians hurt. At one point, the Ontario government told the First Nations people in Six Nations that, okay, you can stay on this land that's before the courts. So at that point, we had no authority to evict them. The owner of the land, technically the government who bought it off the builder, the developer, said you can stay there. So what was our authority to take them off there? So non-native people are coming and trying to run on there and start a fight. We know they're going to get killed. So we're arresting them to keep them from getting killed, and now we're picking on the non-natives and not dealing with the problem. The native people that are on this land illegally when the government said they could be there. A lot of the stuff never got to the media and through the media to the public. Didn't really understand all those issues. But I and Commissioner Fantino before me said we will not go and tell a young widow of an OPP officer that was killed that, sorry your husband got killed, but we got that piece of land back for 5 minutes. And by the way, the native people own it anyway. It's not worth it. But that's a hard thing to sell to people that are living in that area and affected by it. But I stand by that position, and that's the reality of the situation. So meantime, while all this is unfolding on the local policing, community policing front, and First Nations communities are policed in one of 3 ways. Either by special constables that are appointed in Ontario by the Commissioner of the OPP, and they police the community with supervision and support of the Provincial Police. So in Quebec it's the SQ, and the other provinces it's the RCMP. Or the Provincial Police, or the RCMP, where they're the Provincial Police, police communities by themselves, with no First Nations constables, or in some cases, and very few, there's standalone First Nations police departments. But they're paid not by the community, they're paid 52% by the feds, 48% by the province. Well, guess what? The province doesn't want to pay 1 penny more than 48%, and the feds don't want to pay 1 penny more than 52%, and it's never enough. And sometimes money doesn't get spent, so the other half will say, well, we're not spending our piece either now. So in the meantime, you've got people that are working under-supervised, under-equipped, under-trained, with no infrastructure because nobody wants to pay for it. And I get the challenges around it. But how do you attract personnel? How do you retain personnel when you're living in a flying community in Northern Ontario that has no stores, no shopping, no athletic facilities, no real estate, no apartments, no condos, and you're going to police that community and hire people to do that and then not pay them and not, and times they don't even get paid because there's a fight over who's going to pay them. And living in a police station, when you drop a quarter on the floor, it takes you an hour to chase it down the hall because the thing's on stilts and it's falling over, and the police cars are burned in the parking lot. Like, this is not a good situation. Hard to attract personnel. And so a lot of officers, many Aboriginal officers try. They try so hard, and they get hired in their communities, and they're arresting their brothers and their aunts and their uncles, and they're fighting with their own family members, and they're seeing 8-year-old kids committing suicide because they feel there's no hope in the community. That's an awful way to try and police. And you've got nowhere to live, so on your days off you leave the community to get the heck out. So there's not local police, and like most communities that we're used to, that are mentoring, helping, coaching, and helping kids stay away from certain lifestyles. They're just bouncers trying to go to calls and break up fights. It's just a horrific situation. So they hire non-First Nations people, non-Aboriginal people, and they go in the community just to get their foot in the door in policing, and the moment they can, they're going to quit and go to Toronto or Peel or the OPP or some other department. So there's a constant changeover, and nobody takes ownership. The community doesn't belong to these officers for the most part. They're just in there, get some experience, and get the heck out. So is there true community policing? Do they really get to know the community? It's a real sad situation. And most of these communities in the far north are remote. You can only get there by plane or on winter roads. No running water. people buried in the front lawn. There's heads. They're chasing people in the dark, tripping over headstones in front lawns of houses. Septic systems non-existent. This is third world conditions, and this is in this country and in this province of Ontario. No organized sport for kids, no shopping, nothing. Crumbling infrastructures and young kids committing suicide. You know, as a young 8-year-old, there's times I was mad at my mom, and there's times I was mad at my dad, and there's times I was disappointed about stuff. I never thought in a million years about taking my life. What 8-year-old kid does. But in First Nations communities, it's happening all the time. It's happening in this province. And you don't even hear about it because it's in First Nations communities. It's not downtown Toronto or downtown Mississauga or downtown Barrie. Commonplace. Kids in communities so emotionally fragile, they're killing themselves. It'd be a national news story if it happened anywhere else. But First Nations communities. You can imagine if in the city of Toronto, Scarborough received less training, less cars, less bodies, a poor radio system that you can't even get back up on, and there's no one to back you up when you call because there's no one else working anyway. Poor equipment, and on and on and on. If that happened just in Scarborough, to use that example, and because it was a specific cultural group that made up the community, and it wasn't occurring anywhere else in Toronto, that'd be an international news story. But in this province and in this country, we have First Nations communities, that's the way they're treated in terms of policing. And it's not right. So what are we going to do about this? We need a national strategy in First Nations policing. Governments don't want to take this on because the feds don't want to say, oh, we're not going to lead this because that looks like we own it. Provinces are saying, we don't want to take this on because then it looks like we own it. Nobody wants to own it. And communities are suffering. And officers are living in horrendous situations and they're quitting. And talk about, as Stan said when he was up here, talk about PTSD and operational stress injuries in communities who are cutting down your nephew who's an 8-year-old from a tree, and then you got to go to a bar fight 10 minutes later, or domestic. So we need a national strategy. We need the feds, the provinces, and the territories to take ownership. It can't just be the feds and the provinces and the territories don't take any ownership at all. They must all take ownership and form a true tripartite arrangement and agreements. Adequate and effective policing should be provided by First Nations officers for the most part that understand the culture, understand the people, and understand the issues. They deserve the same community or training equipment support as non-First Nations communities. They require proper oversight. There's no legislative framework for First Nations policing. In the Police Services Act of Ontario, there's about 3 sentences to talk about Native constables and the ability to appoint them. The Commissioner of the OPP, that's it. The Police Act doesn't apply to them. SIU and some of those things don't apply to them. The policing, what's it called, OPRIRD, I can never remember all these acronyms, but they really look after public complaints. They don't have anything to do with First Nations policing. They have no legislative framework by which they operate. So they need oversight by a proper body that understands the issues, made up of First Nations people and others that understand the issues and are culturally sensitive. They need alternative justice processes in First Nations community, because just locking up someone, okay, you're fined $300, there's 4 days in jail. Well, it's going to be the 4 days in jail, because they don't have the $300 in Atawasca. And so dangerous situations. A lot of people are being jailed, and First Nations people are overrepresented in the correctional systems in this province. So that's not working. So jailing people because they can't pay a fine for relatively small and minor offenses isn't working. So we need those changes. Now, Minister Nakvi, who's Community Services Community Safety and Correctional Services Minister, recently announced he wants to change the Police Services Act, which was written, I think, back when we rode horses to work. Sorry, Brian, I know you're kind of sensitive about horse issues. That needs to be done, and that act needs to be changed. I'm glad the government's talking about doing it, but they need to write, we need public policy, and we need legislation on First Nations policing. So that in a nutshell, in the limited time I had, is not only a walkthrough time, but just outlines critical issues we're facing on the protest front, and that is not going to go away. And some people don't like it when I say this, but First Nations communities across this country are united through social media and united through cause and beliefs and by the spoken word that's been passed on for generations. And if they want to shut this country down, they're going to shut it down. They're going to shut down every highway and every railway, and no trade and no travel is going to occur. And yeah, we'll win. The military have to come in, and it'll be like a war. It'll be like it was in the March West. It'll be like cavalry and natives fighting. And do we want that as a country? There has to be solutions that governments need to work through that prevent that from happening, or a lot of people are going to die. And that's a sad reality. So those are my opinions. As I always say when I speak publicly, some people are going to like what I say, some people are going to hate what I say, and there's going to be a whole bunch in the middle that could care one way, less one way or another. But these are critical issues that we should care about as Canadians, in my view. So that's it. And I know you wanted me to open the floor to any questions. I hope we have time for that, because I'm sure it went longer than I was supposed to. But I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your service. For those that are military or have served in the military, or law enforcement people that are here, and some are both military and law enforcement. And I certainly thank all others in the room for their support of policing and law enforcement in this province. I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Question I'd like to ask. Commissioner, I have very close friends who are in the Mohawks, and they don't seem to have the same, how can I say, disparity as what the Ojibwe and some of the other, usually the Iroquois tend to be more intertwined with ourselves. Is there any way that we can encourage us amongst the Ojibwe?
Speak up, please.
Yeah, okay. The question I'm asking is that I have very good friends in the Mohawks in Cayundai, particularly the Chief Dom Miracle. Their society is a very developed society, very similar to ours, and they're very proud of the aspect that the Americans have used the Iroquois model for Congress. I don't see as many disparities as what I see in the Ojibwe, because when I go moose hunting, I do see the Ojibwe, and it is very sad, because they are a nomadic race of people, whereas the Mohawks are very sedimentary. They like to stay in one place, more of a community. Is there any way that we can pass that model on to them to encourage them to become more like that? Because I look at things like the pay no more or take no more symbol that came up.
Idle no more, yeah.
Yeah, idle no more. And the thing that's very surprising is that the amount of money that's pushed out to the different tribes is quite large. And I was quite surprised with the Mohawks, but they have done a lot with their money. And in fact, Sean Brant was expelled because he wasted their money, the one that caused all the railroad problems. And
well, it's a very interesting question, and since time began in this country, there's been disparities amongst communities and difference of opinions on how communities should be run or not. And I know the First Nations people will say, we're tired of you telling us how we should look and how we should act and how we should operate. So there's a lot of pushback there. But when I say that the territories need to take responsibility too, it can't just be the provinces and the feds are just going to provide everything that needs to be provided. There's things that there needs to be agreements reached on some of these issues. In a case in the far north, a certain lady, a female band council chief, was driving around a community with no roads, driving a Denali four-wheel drive, and then went on a hunger strike and et cetera, in a community where there's no running water and kids are going to school hungry every day. So there's huge issues there, but when you try and straighten them out without general agreement from the community leaders themselves and band councils, you just, it's like pushing a pea up a hill with your nose. It just, it's very, very difficult. I mean, and some of the biggest community issues, well, just in Nipperwash last week, there was two factions within Nipperwash that were fighting over the $95 million or whatever was paid out, that who should have got more, and so there's not even agreement in the community, and then to try and invoke something on them, like a better system that's maybe better for the community, is very tough. But a valid point. There's First Nations communities in British Columbia that have resorts, golf courses, condo buildings, wineries, huge developments, and the community members are all working in these places, and there's huge money there. And others say, don't want any part of that, don't want that. And so that's a tough thing to really deal with. Tough for governments to deal with. You have to try.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Please don't hesitate.
Pierre Taillon.
The Algonquin Act, sir, is allowing the Algonquins to get all sorts of territory, highlands in East in Canada.
Yeah.
Is that going to help them out in any way to put that together? Are they working on it? Or?
I don't know what the current status is of that is, Pierre. I mean, I was in a very heated conversation during a negotiation with some people from Akwesasne, and we were downtown Cornwall. And I said, okay, well, I can see your point on your territory, but you're in the city of Cornwall right now. I said, we own it too. So, I mean, that's a tough mentality to break, and maybe they do, but, you know, not all these deals did people get ripped off. And the whole Algonquin thing is a huge thing, and the Algonquins aren't in agreement on how all that should be divided or not too, so I don't know where that's going. You know, but it's not moving at breakneck speed either. You know, it's a glacial speed, which adds to the frustration. Sometimes that's the fault of the First Nations negotiators too, and other times it's the fault of the governments. David Pearson was assigned at one point to lead the negotiation down in Caledonia and in Six Nations, and then 6 months later he was gone. Someone else was brought in, and 6 months later they're gone. And the First Nations people say, we're going to straighten this thing out, because as soon as someone new comes in, they got to start from scratch again. And the Algonquin agreements are very plagued by that sort of issue as well. They're huge, they're way, you know, and it's so much bigger than policing. It's that the police get stuck with having to deal with the after effects of all this stuff. And then once again, no winners, absolutely no winners. In one case in northwestern Ontario, they had a blockade of a provincial highway, and we videoed, we talked, we recorded all the dialogue with the leaders, and we said, we are going to arrest you all at some point. We'll give you another couple of days, but this is coming to an end, and we're going to arrest you, as we did many times in other situations, violent arrests, but the media never covered that. They certainly covered the ones where we didn't march in right away. But in that case, eventually we said enough, and we arrested everybody. Went before the Ministry of Attorney General. The local Crown Attorney said charge them based on, you know, we're dealing with some sensitive legal issues, so we sought legal advice. Local Crown Attorney said, yes, I believe there's a reasonable prospect of conviction here, yada yada. And went to the Ministry office in Toronto, and they said, no, we don't want to charge anybody. So what, you know, that makes it even tougher for us, because they know the threat is we're going to arrest you someday. You know, we'll give you a few more days, but we're going to arrest you. And then you arrest them and the Crown says we don't want to lay charges, you know, because it becomes so political. And it's the same governments that are dealing with them on land claim issues. They're making decisions whether or not to lay charges against them. So it's a difficult situation. Questions? Yes, Julian.
Yeah, go ahead.
Chris, you raise a really great point about what many of us have seen in the North, and that we have a third world in our first world. And what thoughts have you got on how can we get the public to actually acknowledge that? Because it strikes me that we've got an election on right now, and I haven't heard anything about it.
Not much.
They'll just keep fighting amongst each other.
Yeah.
But the public in general will not move on this, yet will move on issues of refugees in Syria and Iraq and all of those sort of things. Well, we don't care.
And Julian, you make a valid point. I don't have the answer. If I did, I'd be writing books on it. It's sad. I mean, and take that away for a minute, to get political for just a minute. There's people starving to death in downtown Toronto. There's kids starving to death in communities and being abused in non-native communities all over this country too. And we'll spend millions and millions of dollars for refugees. And I get that. I'm supportive of doing something to help, but like we don't even have our own act together, and it's a never-ending cycle of confusion and concern with no answer. I don't, you know, some leader somewhere is going to take this by the horn and put the right people together to get these things done, but it never seems to happen. And there's another election going to be called somewhere else, and they're going to put that on hold. And in the meantime, a bridge is on fire somewhere, and we're called in. People say, "Why aren't you going in there arresting 1,000 people?" Okay, well, we'll send a few guys to do that. You know. Difficult situation. And I get both sides of it. Once again, I don't condone the use of violence and criminal acts. But, you know, some of the stories that come out of Caledonia, I'm sorry about taking extra time, but one was that some poor builder got beaten up and almost killed in a house that he was building. While the police stood there and watched it, did nothing. Like, try to fight that down and say, no, it didn't happen. The reality of what happened was our guys were dealing with protests a block away, weren't even in visible view of the house that the assault occurred inside of. So they're beating this poor guy up, and they did beat him up, and it was awful. Inside a house, so we're nowhere near, we don't find out till when an ambulance gets called. Our guys see the ambulance going there, think, what the heck's going on in there? But that got parlayed by some media outlets and by some authors that we all stood there and watched him get the boots put to him and didn't do anything about it. Well, what a confidence does that give the public and the police when and it didn't even happen, but nobody wants to hear that. So try to get messages across about that is challenging enough, let alone some of the horrendous things that are occurring in those communities. I know officers in the OPP that can't even talk about things they saw in some communities up north, like Pekanjika, without crying. Yeah, because it's that bad, and it's still going on right now, as we speak.
Are there any other questions in the audience? Yeah.
Sir,
Mike?
we hear in the media about a certain ethnic community that wants to come to Canada and bring their own brand of law into our spectrum. You spoke about the Aboriginals who are the First Nations that have a high level of incarceration. What is your experience with the Band Council and their administration of justice within their spectrum for minor offenses that would probably be an alternative to incarceration, sir?
Well, I know it's worked very effectively in some communities. There just hasn't been enough rigor around processes and authorities to do that. And cops are still very black and white. You know, it's like as a street officer, I know you're in training now, but as street officers, you broke the law. You know, we got to deal with that. And it's hard for police to get their heads around some of these alternative justice healing circles, and where the victim and others come in and sit and talk, and the community actually, you know, looks after kind of meeting out punishment, and it's a whole different concept. Now Kim Derry and others, you know, have been doing some of the stuff around the world. But it's tough to get our own people's heads around it, and then to get the community to buy in, and then what are all the legal frameworks around that? Because you know out there in some non-native community somewhere, they're going to say, well, my son went to jail for that, and up there you passed a rock around the circle and made him say he's sorry. You know, and I hate to be trite, but that's kind of the reality of the way some people are going to look at it. So they're really, really tough issues. And once again, I don't have the answers. I wish I did. I wish whoever our Prime Minister is or going to be had the answers too. But I think what's important is that everybody needs to take it serious and do something about it. Start the processes to deal with these things and quit letting them linger to the point the cops get called in and have to deal with this mess. It's not even, for the most part, it's not even a policing issue anymore. It's a military operation. I had a video of a shootout that happened in Akwesasne back around the time of Oka, around 1990. Two factions within the community fighting against one another that you'd swear it was from Vietnam. Just automatic gunfire, boom, 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 like just unbelievable. You'd swear it was a scene from some movie you saw on TV, and it was in Ontario, in Akwesasne on Cornwall Island. Like scary, scary stuff.
This concludes today's webcast. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for listening. You can keep up with coming events at the RCMI by visiting our website at www.rcmi.org. We hope you'll tune in again, and we hope to see you in person at coming events. Thank you and goodbye.